Hello and welcome. Whether you're listening in the quiet stillness of the night or taking a peaceful pause during the day, this gentle journey invites you to step into a world newly shaped by independence and reflection. Make yourself comfortable. Let your breath slow and deepen. Allow the echoes of conflict and debate to fade into calm. Together, we'll drift into the moments that followed the birth of a nation. This is Changes After the American Revolution, a serene exploration of how life, ideas, and identity quietly transformed once the fighting ended. Take a slow, steady breath. As you exhale, imagine early morning light settling over small towns, farms, and growing cities. The war is over. The banners are folded away, and the sound of marching has faded. In this peaceful retelling, there is no urgency, no clash, only the slow work of rebuilding and reimagining. We move gently through a young nation, learning how to govern itself, how to define freedom, and how to live with the weight of its own ideals. Picture yourself standing on a quiet road that stretches between fields and villages. The air is fresh, carrying the scent of soil and wood smoke. Conversations turn from survival to possibility, from what was lost to what might be built. Though you remain safely where you are, you may sense the careful hope of the moment, balanced between uncertainty and promise. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the changes that followed the American Revolution, how government took shape, how daily life shifted, how beliefs about rights, labor, and identity evolved. We'll move slowly and thoughtfully through these moments, letting history unfold like a calm sunrise over a new republic. For now, settle in, breathe deeply, and allow this peaceful journey into the post-revolutionary world to begin. Dawn of a new nation. The American Revolution ended in hard-won triumph, but its conclusion marked only the beginning of a profound transformation. In 1783, as cannons fell silent and the Treaty of Paris confirmed independence, the former 13 colonies had faced an uncertain dawn. The war had exacted a staggering cost. Cities and farms lay war-weary, trade was disrupted, and a generation bore the scars of 8 years of conflict. Yet amid the exhaustion was a swell of hope, the chance to create a new society founded on Republican ideals and liberty. Victory in the Revolution meant not just separation from Britain, but the daunting task of nation building. The very people who had been British subjects now had to define what it meant to be Americans, forging a national identity out of diversity. They would have to build new governments, repair a shattered economy, settle vast frontiers, and reconcile the lofty ideals of the Revolution with social realities. In this calm and reflective narrative, we will journey through the turbulent yet hopeful decades following the American Revolution. We will revisit the fragile 1780s when the newly independent states struggled under the loose Articles of Confederation and an economy in shambles. We will witness the Constitutional Convention of 1787 as if peering into Independence Hall by candlelight, observing the wise and worried faces of the Founding Fathers as they debated the future. As the United States takes its first steps under a new constitution, we will explore the emergence of political parties, the efforts to stabilize finances, and the expansion westward over majestic mountains and through dense forests. In gentle tones, this story also illuminates the lives of those often left in the background. The Indigenous nations grappling with a new order imposed upon their lands, enslaved African Americans yearning for freedom in a land of liberty, and women who had contributed to independence yet returned to a constrained domestic sphere. All the while, the young republic navigated a world of powerful empires. Relations with Britain remained fraught. France's own revolution sent shockwaves across the ocean, and Spain's control of the Mississippi River tested American resolve. Culturally, Americans began to see themselves not as colonists, but as citizens of an independent nation. A transition felt in the pages of vibrant newspapers, in new schools and colleges, and in a slowly coalescing sense of national unity. Through chronological and thematic reflections, we will examine these post-revolutionary transformations in depth, maintaining a serene and atmospheric tone. Imagine sitting beside a crackling hearth as a soft voice recounts how a fledgling nation found its footing step by step in the calm after the storm of revolution. Let us begin this journey with a brief recap of the revolution itself to set the scene for the changes that followed. The American Revolution, 1775-1783, had been a daring gamble by the colonies to secure unalienable rights and self-governance. It started as local protests against British taxes and grew into a full-scale war for independence. Farmers became soldiers overnight. Merchants and mechanics left their shops to take up muskets. The odds had been against the Patriots, a ragtag continental army facing the world's mightiest empire. There were dark moments, the bitter winter at Valley Forge where determination kept hope alive around feeble campfires, and the fluctuating fortunes on battlefields across 13 colonies. But with perseverance and crucial aid from allies, especially France, victory was achieved. General George Washington's triumph at Yorktown in 1781 effectively ended the fighting, and by 1783 the colonies were free. Independence had been secured, but now Americans faced a poignant question articulated during the war. Could they begin the world over again, as Thomas Paine optimistically wrote, and live up to the ideals for which they had fought? The end of the revolution was both exhilarating and sobering. The colonies turned states found themselves no longer under British rule, but also without the structure that British governance had provided. Old institutions of monarchy and aristocracy had been cast off, but what would replace them remained to be seen. The period immediately after the war would test whether this new experiment in liberty could survive. In the glow of independence, Americans celebrated, but they also confronted immense challenges. As one era ended, another began, a chapter of instability, creativity, conflict, and change. The following sections will guide us through these changes after the American Revolution, unfolding gently and with historical richness, like a well-loved story told on a quiet evening. Political challenges in the 1780s. The weakness of the Articles of Confederation. In the 1780s, the United States existed in a fragile and unsettled condition. Under the Articles of Confederation, the nation was less a unified country and more a loose league of sovereign states tenuously held together. Each state jealously guarded its independence, and the firm league of friendship established by the Articles left a weak central authority that often seemed powerless to act. Americans had designed this system in reaction to the centralized British tyranny they feared, but in curing one ill, they created another. The Confederation Congress had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce between states, and no national judiciary to settle disputes. Decisions required the cooperation of state governments that saw themselves as primary. As a result, governing the new republic was extraordinarily difficult. In these years, each state operated under its own constitution and often pursued its own interests. Congress could make requests of the states for funds, for troops, for adherence to treaties, but it could not compel obedience. The new nation had no president or effective executive authority, only committees of Congress. This political structure, born of revolutionary fears of centralized power, quickly proved inadequate. We are one nation today and 13 tomorrow, George Washington lamented in frustration, highlighting the inconsistency and disunity that plagued the Confederation. One of the clearest signs of trouble was the issue of finance. Congress, unable to levy taxes directly, could only ask states for money to pay national debts and expenses. More often than not, the states paid only a fraction of what was requested, if they paid at all. The result was chronic bankruptcy at the national level. The government that had won the war could not afford to pay even the interest on its loans or the wages owed to soldiers who had secured independence. In 1783, disgruntled Continental Army officers encamped near Newburgh's, New York, contemplated marching on Congress to demand their back pay, an event known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. Although General Washington diffused that crisis with an emotional appeal to his officers' honor, the underlying problem remained. A government without money or means to fulfill its obligations stood on shaky ground. Economic troubles fed into political and social unrest, testing the limits of the weak government. After the war, the United States slipped into a serious depression. British trade restrictions hit hard. American exports were barred from lucrative markets in the British West Indies, and cheap British manufactured goods flooded American ports, undercutting local artisans. At the same time, state governments had accumulated heavy debts during the war. Lacking sufficient gold or silver, hard currency, they often resorted to printing paper money, which quickly depreciated. Inflation soared, and many currencies issued by state banks or legislatures became nearly worthless, hindering commerce as each state's money was different and mistrusted. This chaotic economic situation made everyday life difficult for ordinary citizens. A major economic depression, as one contemporary described it, gripped the country. As the 1780s progressed, farmers and working people felt the pinch of hard times and the weight of debts they could not pay. Many had borrowed money during the war or after, expecting prosperity and independence, but now faced creditors demanding payment in scarce hard currency. State legislatures, under pressure, often enacted laws to ease the burden on debtors, for example, allowing payment delays or accepting payment in kind, goods instead of cash. These measures helped farmers but enraged creditors and wealthier classes who saw them as an attack on property rights and contracts. James Madison observed that political struggles in the states had begun to pit the class with and the class without property against each other. The social fabric was strained as economic policy became a tug of war between debtor relief and creditor rights. Nowhere did these tensions explode more dramatically than in Massachusetts during 1786 and 1787 in the uprising known as Shays's Rebellion. Picture the tranquil hills and farms of western Massachusetts in the autumn of 1786. The harvest is in, but many farmers find that selling their crops will not bring in enough hard currency to pay their taxes and debts, taxes which had been raised sharply to pay off state war debt. Courts are foreclosing on farms. Neighbors see each other's property seized and auctioned to satisfy creditors. Many of these struggling farmers are veterans of the Revolution, men like Captain Daniel Shays, who had fought at Bunker Hill and Saratoga. They feel betrayed that the country they defended now threatens to take away their homes and land for debts when paper money is worthless and coin is nowhere to be found. In local taverns and meeting houses, they murmur that King George's taxes were lighter than this. A resolve hardens. They will not let the courts continue to sit in judgment against them. In late August 1786, crowds of farmers began to march on county courthouses, forcibly shutting them down to prevent further foreclosures. Home of Captain Shays in Pelham, Massachusetts, as it appeared in the 19th century. Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, led one of the most significant post-war rebellions when economic hardship and heavy taxes drove Massachusetts farmers to protest in 1786, 1787. The modest farmhouse and rocky fields evoke the rural world of the Revolutionary veterans who took up arms again, this time against their own state government. As the rebellion escalated, the Massachusetts state government, dominated by Eastern merchants and creditors, saw the protests as anarchy and treason. Governor James Bowdoin raised a privately funded militia. Since the state militia had many sympathizers with the rebels and dispatched General Benjamin Lincoln to restore order. In January 1787, Shays and his band of nearly 1,500 farmers made a desperate move to seize the federal arsenal at Springfield, hoping to arm themselves. It was a cold New England day. Imagine the breath of men and horses clouding the air as they approached the arsenal. Lincoln's militia confronted them. Warning shots were fired, then grape shot from cannon. Several rebels fell dead in the snow, and the rest scattered. Shays's rebellion had been quashed, but its impact reverberated far beyond Massachusetts. In the aftermath, most of the rebels, including Shays, were eventually pardoned, but the lesson was clear to national leaders. The existing government had nearly lost control of an entire state. The Confederation Congress had been helpless to assist Massachusetts. It could not raise funds for troops, nor compel the states to act. "We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion," wrote George Washington as he watched these events with alarm. The rebellion showed the weakness of the federal government under the Articles and frightened many moderate Americans who feared that if drastic changes were not made, the hard-won victory of the Revolution might dissolve into chaos. Even outside Massachusetts, the 1780s were rife with smaller insurgencies and conflicts. In various states, clashing interests led to inconsistent policies and even talk of splintering the Union. States argued over boundaries and navigation rights. A crisis brewed over access to the Mississippi River, vital to frontier settlers, when Spanish authorities closed it to American commerce. Some frustrated Westerners murmured about aligning with Spain or Britain if the United States could not secure their interests. In 1786, a convention in Annapolis, Maryland, was called to address trade disputes between states. Though sparsely attended, that Annapolis Convention issued a call for a broader meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation. The stage was set for the pivotal gathering in Philadelphia the next year. In the calm light of hindsight, the problems of the 1780s can be seen as growing pains of a new nation testing the limits of a flawed system. At the time, however, there was genuine fear that the spirit of '76 might unravel into disunion. The states had proven their ability to act together in war. Could they act together in peace? Voices that once championed strong state sovereignty began to reconsider. The very men who fought the revolution for liberty now confronted the sobering possibility that too little authority in government could imperil the survival of the liberty they had fought for. The country stood at a crossroads. Out of the turmoil and uncertainty rose a determination to create a more perfect union, one that could keep peace at home, pay its debts, and command respect abroad. The next section will take us to Philadelphia in 1787, where delegates from across the states gathered in the sweltering summer to reshape the framework of American government and address the weaknesses that the 1780s had laid bare. The Constitutional Convention of 1787, forging a stronger union. In May 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island, distrustful of central power, boycotted the meeting, converged on Philadelphia. They came to the old Pennsylvania State House, the same hall where the Declaration of Independence had been debated, with authorization merely to revise the Articles of Confederation. But it quickly became apparent that mere amendments would not suffice. The decision was made behind closed doors to draft an entirely new constitution. Over that summer, 55 delegates, among them George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and other luminaries, engaged in intense debate. It was a mix of generations. Washington and Franklin were in their 50s and 80s respectively, venerable heroes lending credibility and calm, while younger men in their 30s, like Madison and Hamilton, brought fresh ideas and restless energy. The windows were kept shut to deter eavesdroppers, despite the heat. Inside, quill pens scratched on parchment, and low voices argued the principles of Republican government as late into the afternoons. Seen at the signing of the Constitution of the United States, painted by Howard Chandler Christie. In this idealized depiction, George Washington, standing on the dais right, presides over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin, seated prominently in front, and Alexander Hamilton, standing and gesturing at left, are among the delegates depicted. The signing on September 17, 1787, symbolized the culmination of months of debate, resulting in a new framework of government designed to unite the states under a stronger federal system. The Constitutional Convention was both a political struggle and a collaborative work of art, as delegates balanced competing interests and philosophies to draft a new charter of government. Two major factions soon emerged, foreshadowing the political parties of the future. On one side were nationalists like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong central government that could supersede the states on critical issues. They feared the chaos of the Articles and believed only a firmer union could save the Republic. Opposing them were delegates, often later called anti-federalists, like George Mason and Patrick Henry, though Henry refused to attend, famously saying he smelled a rat in Philadelphia, who were deeply wary of centralized power and protective of state sovereignty. These men remembered the Revolution's fight against distant authority and did not want to trade King George for a powerful federal government. The debates seesawed between these positions. Madison's Virginia Plan, introduced early on, set the tone. It proposed a national government with three branches: legislative, executive, judicial, a bicameral Congress with representation based on population and broad powers over the states. This bold plan favored populous states like Virginia and Pennsylvania. In contrast, small state delegates rallied behind the New Jersey Plan, which kept a one-state, one-vote Congress akin to the Articles, but with slightly enhanced powers. For a time, the convention was deadlocked. The mood grew tense in the sweltering assembly room. How could they reconcile the interests of large and small states? The answer came through compromise. The Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise, brokered by Roger Sherman, offered a dual system of representation. In the House of Representatives, states would be represented according to population, whereas in the Senate, each state would have an equal vote, 2 senators each. This two-house Congress soothed both sides. Large states got proportional influence in one chamber. Small states secured equality in the other. It was a turning point that kept the convention together. Another divisive issue was slavery, morally charged and regionally split. Although some northern delegates opposed slavery, they knew southern states would never join a union that threatened the institution. A tragically telling compromise was reached. For purposes of representation and taxation, each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person, the infamous 3/5 compromise. This deal gave slaveholding states more seats in the House than they would have had if only free persons counted. Additionally, the convention agreed not to allow Congress to ban the international slave trade for at least 20 years, until 1808. The word slavery never appeared in the Constitution's text, but it was embedded in these provisions, a pragmatic concession to unity that laid the groundwork for future conflict. Some delegates, like Mason and Edmund Randolph, were so unhappy that the Constitution did not explicitly protect rights or more strongly address slavery that they refused to sign at the end. Meanwhile, arguments raged on over the presidency. Many feared a single executive could become a monarch in disguise. Others argued the nation needed a decisive leader. Ultimately, they created a presidency with limited but potent powers, balanced by periodic elections and the possibility of removal through impeachment. George Washington's presumed willingness to serve as the first president reassured skeptics. No one could imagine the beloved general becoming a tyrant. Indeed, Washington's dignified presence as convention president lent credibility to the whole endeavor. After nearly 4 months of secrecy and struggle, the delegates produced a document that astonished even themselves. On September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was signed by 39 of the delegates. As Benjamin Franklin stepped out of the hall, a Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia famously asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." His wry response underscored that the work was far from over. Now this new Constitution had to be approved by the people in the states. The proposed Constitution created a government with far greater strength and agility than the old Confederation. It established a true federal system, dividing authority between the national government and the states. Congress gained the power to levy taxes, regulate interstate and international commerce, provide for the common defense, and make laws necessary and proper to carry out its duties. The national government alone could coin money and maintain armed forces, ending the troubling practice of separate state armies and currencies. An executive branch, headed by a president, would enforce the laws, and a federal judiciary headed by a Supreme Court would adjudicate disputes under the law. In short, the states would no longer be sovereign entities unto themselves. They were bound together under a supreme law of the land. Yet the Constitution was also a document of balances and limitations. The delegates, steeped in Enlightenment thought, carefully crafted checks and balances to prevent any one branch from dominating. The legislature was split into House and Senate to moderate its power. The president could veto laws but could be overridden or impeached. Judges had independence but could be checked by constitutional amendment or legislation. This intricate system was the framers' answer to the age-old challenge: empower the government enough to govern, but constrain it enough to protect liberty. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, James Madison would later write, explaining that each branch's desire for influence would keep the others in check. When the text of the Constitution became public, it set off the next great battle, ratification. Each state held a convention to debate approving the new frame of government. This process turned into a rich and vigorous national conversation between Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who opposed it or wanted changes. The Federalists, a term co-opted by Madison, Hamilton, and their allies, wrote eloquent defenses of the new system, most famously the Federalist Papers, a series of essays by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. These essays, published in newspapers under the pseudonym Publius, explained how the Constitution would work and argued that a stronger union was essential for American survival and prosperity. Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, voiced deep anxieties. They worried that the Constitution drifted too far from the Revolution's principles, creating a central government that could become tyrannical. They pointed out the lack of a Bill of Rights, explicit protections for individual liberties, as a dangerous omission. Writers like Brutus and Cato, pseudonyms used by anti-federalist essayists, warned that an extensive republic might crush the rights of citizens and the autonomy of states. The ratification debate raged in print and in packed meeting halls from late 1787 through much of 1788. Slowly, the Federalists gained the upper hand, often by promising to add a Bill of Rights once the new government was in place. States began to ratify. Delaware was first, proudly calling itself the first state. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut followed in quick succession. In Massachusetts, a crucial state with strong anti-federalist sentiment, ratification succeeded by a narrow margin only after assurances that amendments protecting rights would be added. The turning point came when Virginia and New York, the largest and among the most divided states, each ratified in the summer of 1788. Virginia with recommended amendments, New York after Hamilton and Madison's relentless campaigning. By late 1788, 11 states had ratified, crossing the required threshold of 9 for the Constitution to take effect. North Carolina and Rhode Island would initially hold out. Rhode Island even put the Constitution to a popular vote, which failed, but both eventually joined by 1790, after the new government was up and running and the promise of a Bill of Rights was being fulfilled. Thus, in 1789, the United States began an unprecedented experiment, a nation under a written federal constitution designed by and for we the people. The final act of the founding drama was the addition of the Bill of Rights in 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These amendments are drafted largely by James Madison in the new Congress, answered the anti-federalist concerns by explicitly safeguarding freedoms like speech, press, religion, assembly, the right to a fair trial, to bear arms, and protections against unreasonable searches and cruel punishments. With these amendments, skeptics were mollified, and the Constitution gained broader acceptance. The new constitutional framework provided the stability and clarity that had been lacking, creating what one delegate, Gouverneur Morris, proudly called a government that was well worth a fight. For ordinary Americans, the change in governance from the Articles to the Constitution was palpable. Under the Articles, Congress had often seemed feeble and distant. Under the Constitution, the federal government soon proved capable of action. The sense of having a unified nation, the United States spoken of as a single entity rather than a plural collection, began to take hold. One famous change in phrasing captures this evolution. In the 1780s, people said the United States are, treating the states as plural, but increasingly after the Constitution, one would say the United States is, reflecting the Union's singular identity. The Convention of 1787 stands as a watershed. Through compromise and vision, the founders built a more perfect union. Addressing the failings of the 1780s while striving to honor the Revolution's democratic ideals. Of course, not all ideals were met. Slavery remained entrenched, and many Americans, women, Native Americans, black people, the poor, were excluded from full participation. Yet the Constitution was a living framework, open to amendment and interpretation, which in time could be used to expand rights and representation. For now, it offered a chance for the new nation to steady itself. As the delegates departed Philadelphia in September 1787, a sense of cautious optimism prevailed. George Washington, soon to be called from his Virginia farm to serve as the first president, confided that the Constitution was not perfect, but no work of man ever was. He supported it because it seemed the best hope for the Republic's survival. The coming years would test that Constitution and bring it to life. With the government restructured, attention turns to how the new Republic actually functioned in its early years. In the next section, we step into the era of George Washington's presidency, 1789-1797, and beyond, observing how the political landscape evolved. We will see fledgling political parties take shape despite the founders' ambivalence toward factions. We will also delve into how this new government tackled the enormous economic challenges inherited from the war and Confederation years. It is time to explore the Federalist era, a period when the foundations of American governance were laid down in practice, not just on parchment. The early Republic's government. Washington, Federalists, and the rise of parties. In the spring of 1789, the new United States government under the Constitution commenced, tentatively but full of promise. George Washington journeyed from Mount Vernon to New York City, then the nation's capital, to take the oath of office as the first president. It was April 30th, 1789, a day of jubilation. Crowds lined the streets, church bells rang, and Washington, visibly solemn, swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution on a balcony at Federal Hall. The experiment had officially begun. Washington's presidency would set crucial precedents, for he was aware that I walk on untrodden ground, as he said. Every action of the first administration would become a model for those that followed. The first Congress quickly got to work, fleshing out the bare bones of the Constitution. They created executive departments, state, treasury, war, to assist the president, established a federal judiciary via the Judiciary Act of 1789, and, as promised, drafted the Bill of Rights. Washington assembled a cabinet of brilliant minds, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. These men, particularly Jefferson and Hamilton, would soon find themselves at odds, giving rise to the nation's first political parties, despite the common hope that no such factions would form. At first, there was a spirit of unity in the capital. The challenges the new government faced were enormous: reviving the economy, managing a mountain of war debt, pacifying the frontier, and navigating a world of powerful European empires. Washington, nearly universally revered, provided steady leadership. In 1790, he toured New England. Later, he toured the southern states. By simply appearing as president among the people, he helped cement loyalty to the new federal government. The concept of Americans as one people began to feel more real as citizens saw the president with their own eyes, often describing him in almost reverential terms. One of the earliest and most urgent tasks was solving the economic crisis and establishing national credit. The new Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, was a man of vision and intellect, brimming with plans to strengthen the republic. Hamilton believed that the federal government needed to assume a leading role in economic affairs, which put him at odds with more agrarian-minded leaders like Jefferson. In 1790, Hamilton presented to Congress his ambitious financial program. He proposed that the federal government assume the remaining state debts from the Revolutionary War and pay off the national debt by issuing new federal bonds. This policy of debt assumption was designed to tie the states and wealthy creditors firmly to the new national government's success. However, not all states had the same level of debt. Some states, like Massachusetts, had heavy debts, while others, like Virginia, had paid most of theirs off, so the plan was controversial. After much debate, a compromise was struck. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison agreed to Hamilton's debt plan in exchange for locating the future permanent national capital along the Potomac River, what would become Washington, D.C., pleasing Virginia. This famous dinner table bargain smoothed the way for Congress to pass Hamilton's debt plan. With the debts assumed, Hamilton moved to his next pillar, creating a Bank of the United States. He argued that a national bank would stabilize the currency, facilitate trade, and provide loans to spur economic growth. The bank would be a public-private partnership, capitalized at $10 million, with the government owning a fifth of the shares. Jefferson and Madison vehemently objected. They contended that the Constitution did not explicitly authorize Congress to create a bank. Jefferson, a strict constructionist, believed in limiting the federal government to powers expressly listed in the Constitution. Hamilton, on the other hand, espoused a loose interpretation, invoking the necessary and proper clause, Article V's, Section 8, to say Congress could charter a bank as a means to carry out its enumerated powers, like regulating currency and commerce. President Washington, after careful consideration, sided with Hamilton. The Bank of the United States was established in 1791, headquartered in Philadelphia, for a 20-year charter. It began operations, issuing reliable banknotes and handling government funds. Hamilton's triumph indicated a strong national trajectory. The federal government was taking active steps that were unimaginable under the feeble Articles of Confederation. Hamilton didn't stop there. He also pushed measures to encourage manufacturing and industry. In his Report on Manufactures, 1791, he proposed protective tariffs and government incentives to foster American factories, envisioning a diverse economy not solely dependent on agriculture. Congress was not ready to adopt all these proposals, but Hamilton's forward-thinking plan laid groundwork for the nation's financial system. By the mid-1790s, thanks to Hamilton's policies, U.S. finances were on much firmer ground. The country was paying its debts on time, the currency was stable, and America's credit abroad was vastly improved. Indeed, by 1795, the United States was able to secure loans from Dutch bankers on good terms and even fully repay its Revolutionary War debt to France. One observer noted that the United States was able to place itself on a sound financial footing during the 1790s, preempting diplomatic embarrassments and establishing credit that would later enable big endeavors like the Louisiana Purchase. However, these economic policies had unintended political consequences. They sparked the formation of the first political parties. Initially, nobody called themselves Federalist or Anti-Federalist anymore. Those labels were from the ratification fight. But soon, people began speaking of the Friends of Hamilton and the Friends of Jefferson. The Federalists, in this new context, were those aligned with Hamilton's vision. They supported a vigorous federal government, a strong executive, a commercial economy tied to Britain, and order over liberty when the two conflicted. They tended to be merchants, financiers, and prosperous farmers in New England and the Middle States. On the other side emerged the Democratic Republicans, often just called Republicans at the time, led by Jefferson and Madison. They feared that Hamilton's policies favored the rich and undermined the Republican values of the Revolution. Jeffersonian Republicans championed the yeoman farmer, decentralized power, and sympathy with the French Revolution's ideals. They drew support from the agrarian South and Western frontier, and from those wary of big government and financial elites. It's worth noting that the founders generally disdained the concept of party. They associated political parties with factionalism and corruption, something that had plagued British politics. President Washington, in particular, was pained by the growing divide. The spirit of party has descended upon the nation, he lamented as he watched his two chief advisors, Hamilton and Jefferson bitterly diverge. In the early 1790s, Jefferson and Hamilton fought not only in cabinet meetings, but also indirectly in the newspapers. Jefferson, quietly backed by Madison, helped a poet named Philip Freneau establish the National Gazette, a paper which relentlessly criticized Hamilton's program. Hamilton's allies responded by sponsoring John Fenno's Gazette of the United States, which lambasted Jefferson's camp. The press, newly free from British constraints and invigorated by the First Amendment's protection of free speech and press, ratified in 1791, became fiercely partisan. The public was treated to a war of words, editorials and pamphlets accusing one side of monarchism and the other of anarchy. The language could be vicious and hyperbolic, yet it was also a sign of a healthy democratic ferment. Political participation was widening. More people attended meetings, joined political societies, and voted as states lowered some property requirements for voting, though universal white male suffrage was still decades away in most places. As the 1790s progressed, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans crystallized into the first party system. On one side, Hamilton, Vice President John Adams, and their followers embraced the name Federalist, linking themselves to the Constitution's ratification and the idea of union. On the other, Jefferson's followers eventually adopted the name Republican or Democratic Republican to distinguish from the modern Republican Party formed later, emphasizing their commitment to what they saw as true Republican principles and the legacy of 1776. Ironically, although parties were not part of the constitutional design, they emerged from the Constitution's very implementation, a way for like-minded individuals in different states to coordinate their political strategy and philosophy. Washington tried to remain above these partisan frays. He served unanimously elected for 2 terms, from 1789 to 1797, and his personal stature held the nascent government together. In 1792, he even won re-election without formal opposition, as even Jeffersonians conceded that the country needed Washington's steady hand. But underneath that tranquil surface, the storm clouds of party conflict gathered, often related to how the United States should respond to events abroad. Washington's second term was dominated by foreign policy crises that further split Federalists and Republicans, a topic we'll explore in the section on foreign relations. Domestically, however, one event tested the will of the new government and showcased its newfound strength, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. To help fund his economic program, Hamilton had persuaded Congress to pass an excise tax on distilled spirits in 1791, the first federal tax on a domestic product. On paper, it seemed reasonable. In practice, it hit small frontier farmers who often distilled surplus grain into whiskey quite hard. Along the Appalachian frontier, especially in western Pennsylvania, many farmers depended on turning their corn or rye into whiskey, which was easier to transport and trade than bulky grain. The excise agents, seen as officious tax collectors reminiscent of the hated British excisemen, were resisted. By 1794, protests in the western counties of Pennsylvania escalated into an open rebellion. Angry crowds harassed tax officials, and a force of perhaps 6,000 armed farmers gathered, threatening to march on Pittsburgh. It was a critical test. Would this federal government falter as the Confederation did during Shays's rebellion, or could it enforce its laws? President Washington, determined to uphold the rule of law, invoked his constitutional authority to call up the state militias. In an unprecedented move, he personally led, for part of the way, a force of about 13,000 militia troops drawn from several states, a larger army than he had commanded at most times during the Revolution. As this formidable force advanced into western Pennsylvania in autumn 1794, the rebellion melted away. The insurgents dispersed without a major fight, and the federal posse made some token arrests. The Whiskey Rebellion collapsed, demonstrating that the new government would and could use force if necessary to execute federal laws. It was a sobering moment, quieted almost as quickly as it flared up, but its significance was widely noted. Even Jefferson, who sympathized with the distillers' complaints, had to admit that the prompt suppression of the rebellion was an impressive show of federal resolve. Unlike in 1786, there was now a power capable of responding to domestic unrest, a poignant contrast with Shays's rebellion, which had taken months to quell with great difficulty. In 1796, Washington decided to retire, setting another crucial precedent: a peaceful voluntary transfer of power. In his farewell address, printed in newspapers, he offered sage advice to the young nation. He warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party and against entangling permanent alliances abroad. Coming from the man who had led the nation through war and peace, these words resonated, yet already the party system he cautioned against was taking root. The election of 1796 became the first contested presidential election in U.S. history. John Adams, Washington's Federalist vice president, ran as the de facto Federalist candidate, with Thomas Pinckney as a running mate. Thomas Jefferson was the choice of the Democratic Republicans, with Aaron Burr as his running mate. The campaign was vigorous and partisan. Federalists painted Jefferson as a radical Francophile who had imported the chaos of the French Revolution to America. Republicans accused Adams of being an aristocrat at heart who wanted to ape monarchy. When the electoral votes were counted, Adams narrowly won the presidency, 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68. Under the original electoral rules, Jefferson, having the second most votes, became vice president, an arrangement that put a political rival in the second highest office, adding tension to Adams's term. Adams's presidency, 1797 to 1801, was dominated by foreign troubles, particularly a quasi-war with France, and by fierce domestic disputes like the Alien and Sedition Acts. Adams, a staunch Federalist, but also an independent thinker, kept most of Washington's cabinet. However, he lacked Washington's unifying stature and found himself navigating factional divides even within the Federalist Party. Hamilton, though no longer in government, exerted influence and sometimes undermined Adams. The XYZ affair of 1797 to 98, in which French agents demanded bribes from American envoys, outraged American public opinion and led to an undeclared naval war with France. Federalists, riding a wave of anti-French sentiment, pushed through the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which empowered the president to deport non-citizens deemed dangerous and criminalized making false or malicious statements against the government. These acts were ostensibly to protect national security, but in practice they were used to silence Republican critics. Several newspaper editors, and even a congressman, Matthew Lyon of Vermont, were prosecuted under the Sedition Act for criticizing Adams's administration. The irony was stark. Only a decade after the Bill of Rights was adopted, The federal government was jailing people for dissent. Jeffersonians cried foul, arguing that the Sedition Act trampled the First Amendment and was a tool of Federalist tyranny. Jefferson and Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, asserting that states could nullify federal laws they saw as unconstitutional, a controversial doctrine of state resistance. All of this created a highly charged environment leading into the election of 1800. That contest, Adams versus Jefferson, round 2, proved momentous. The Federalists were internally split and tarred by the unpopularity of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Republicans were well organized and riding a wave of grassroots support. The campaign was bitter and personal. Yet when the votes were tallied, Jefferson emerged victorious after a tie in the Electoral College with his running mate Burr was resolved by the House of Representatives. This revolution of 1800, as Jefferson called it, was revolutionary not because of bloodshed or upheaval, but because it was a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, a rarity in a world where leadership changes were often accompanied by violence. Adams graciously, if bitterly, handed over the reins. The young American Republic had passed a fundamental test. It could correct its course through elections and the will of the people rather than through force. Jefferson's inauguration in 1801 was marked by an ethos of reconciliation. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," he declared, emphasizing common values over party animosities. In these early years, the architecture of American governance had been built and tested. A stronger union under the Constitution proved capable of addressing internal revolts, establishing financial credibility, and surviving the crucible of partisan politics. The rise of parties was not an intended development, but it became an engine for engaging citizens in the political process. Voter participation among eligible white males grew, newspapers flourished as forums of debate, and even the rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton arguably helped clarify choices for the electorate. For better or worse, Americans were learning how to absorb passionate political disagreement without shattering the nation. The Federalists, dominant in the 1790s, left a legacy of a solid federal government, a functioning economy, and avoidance of war with major powers during the nation's vulnerable infancy. The Jeffersonian Republicans, taking over in 1801, would usher in a more openly populist style of governance and eventually expand the country's territory with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But by the end of Washington and Adams's administrations, the core framework that would guide the United States was firmly in place. The Constitution had proven to be a robust vessel, though one whose exact meaning would be continually interpreted and contested. Having considered these political developments, it is time to turn to other arenas of change after the Revolution. How did the American economy rebuild and transform in the aftermath of independence? What happened as citizens pushed westward into new lands beyond the Appalachians? And what of those peoples who originally inhabited those vast territories? How did the Revolution's outcome affect the Native American nations? We will explore next the westward expansion, the fate of indigenous peoples, and the management of new territories, which were among the central concerns of the post-revolution era. Economic Challenges and Recovery in the New Nation. Emerging from the Revolutionary War, the United States faced economic devastation and daunting financial challenges. The war had disrupted trade, devastated many local economies, and left both the national government and the individual states deeply in debt. Between 1775 and 1783, the Continental Congress and the states had borrowed millions from foreign allies, France, the Netherlands, Spain, and wealthy domestic creditors. To make matters worse, they had also resorted to printing paper money, the Continental dollar, which by war's end was virtually worthless due to hyperinflation. A popular saying, "not worth a continental," reflected how valueless that currency had become. The cumulative effect was an economic crisis in the 1780s that touched everyone from merchants in Boston to farmers in the backcountry. At the war's conclusion, British mercantile policies further squeezed the new nation. As mentioned earlier, Britain closed its West Indies colonies to American trade and flooded U.S. markets with cheaper goods. American artisans and manufacturers, few as they were, struggled to compete. British manufacturers offered everything from cloth to china at prices that undercut nascent American industries, making it difficult for those industries to take off. The loss of British Caribbean trade also hurt American exporters, especially in states like New England, whose fish and lumber had found ready Caribbean markets before independence. In the countryside, farmers who had expanded production to supply the Continental Army or hoped to profit from independence found post-war depression instead. Farm prices fell, and many farmers who had taken loans during the war were called upon to repay them just when their incomes were lowest. The shortage of gold and silver, hard currency, made it nearly impossible for debtors to meet their obligations. Barter and payment in kind resumed in many rural areas, but creditors, often based in coastal cities or Europe, demanded hard currency. This sparked widespread resentment, especially in rural New England and the South, where debt-related legal actions swamped local courts. Shays's rebellion, discussed previously, was the most dramatic manifestation of this economic distress, but it was by no means isolated. To address the immediate crisis under the Articles of Confederation, some state governments took measures such as printing paper money or passing stay laws to delay debt collections. These moves were welcomed by debtors, but alarmed creditors and conservative leaders who saw them as undermining property rights and economic stability. In Rhode Island, for example, the legislature issued so much paper money and forced creditors to accept it that the state earned the derisive nickname Rogue Island among hard money advocates. The chaos of differing state remedies and currencies contributed to the urgency for a stronger national government that could impose uniform economic policies, one of the key arguments Federalists made in pushing for the Constitution. Once the new government was in place, restoring economic stability and credit was a top priority. We have already traced Alexander Hamilton's financial program, which was central to this effort. Let us examine its impact in more detail. Funding and Assumption of Debt, 1790. By assuming state debts and refinancing all debt at the federal level, Hamilton essentially nationalized the debt problem. Contemporaries noted that this plan turned debt into an asset. Government bonds were issued to creditors, which could be traded and thus provided a form of capital in the economy. Initially, some objected that speculators who had bought up soldiers' IOUs and depreciated state bonds for pennies on the dollar would unfairly profit. Hamilton, however, argued that honoring the debt at full value was essential to establish trust. Paying the debts as promised would show the world that the United States was reliable, encouraging future lending and investment. And indeed, when the plan passed, the market value of U.S. securities rose. Foreign investors took heart that the U.S. would not default. Domestically, wealthy Americans now had a stake in the government's success since they held its bonds. This integrated the interests of the financial class with that of the national government in a way that stabilized the system. Establishing a national bank, 1791, the Bank of the United States further stabilized the currency and credit. By issuing banknotes backed by substantial capital, it created a uniform paper currency far more trusted than the jumbled mix of state notes and private scrip that previously circulated. The bank also provided a depository for federal funds and could lend to the government in emergencies. Over time, it facilitated smoother commerce between regions by providing a standard medium of exchange. Moreover, the bank's presence allowed for expansion of credit to entrepreneurs. Critics worried it centralized too much financial power in Philadelphia and in the hands of a few directors, but in practice it largely acted as a prudent central financial institution. Taxation and revenue. With the power to tax, Congress under the new Constitution enacted tariffs on imports, a main source of federal revenue, and the aforementioned excise taxes. The tariff served two purposes: to raise money and to protect some budding American industries by making imported goods slightly more expensive. The first tariff in 1789 was relatively low, for revenue more than protection, but subsequent ones in the 1790s had protective elements. These tariffs helped American ironworks, glassmakers, and textile mills take their first steps, though Britain's industrial might still far outstrip America's at this time. The excise on whiskey was also a revenue measure, though it had social fallout as we saw. Overall, by the mid-1790s, the federal government had stable income to fund its operations, still very modest by modern standards, and to service the interest on its debt. The combined effect of these policies was that the panic and instability of the 1780s gave way to recovery and growth in the 1790s. The numbers tell part of the story. American per capita income, which had dropped sharply during the war and post-war slump, began to rise again in the early 1790s. Ports like New York, some Boston, and Philadelphia recovered their trade. By 1794, American ships were once again trading with Europe and even the East Indies. The reopening of European markets, Britain and France, despite their war, both needed American goods like cotton, tobacco, and naval stores at different times, helped fuel commerce. However, prosperity was not evenly distributed, and regional economies took different paths. The Northeast began inching towards early industrialization. The first textile mill using water-powered spinning machines opened in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in 1793, built by Samuel Slater, who brought British industrial knowledge to America. Skilled craftsmen in cities formed guilds and societies, and some moved into small-scale manufacturing for domestic markets. The mid-Atlantic states, like New York and Pennsylvania, had a mix of farming and commerce. Philadelphia remained the banking hub, and the fledgling nation's largest city, where the Bank of the United States and other institutions funneled capital. In the southern states, the economy remained predominantly agricultural, powered by slave labor on plantations. The immediate post-war period saw some decline in tobacco markets, but a dramatic development in 1793 changed the South's future: Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. This simple machine made the cleaning of short staple cotton far more efficient. Almost overnight, the vast hinterlands of Georgia, South Carolina, and later Alabama and Mississippi became prime cotton-growing territory. Though this effect would fully boom in the early 1800s, by 1795, 1800 planters were already moving to produce more cotton, responding to high demand from Britain's ravenous textile mills. The result was the revitalization and expansion of slavery in the Deep South, transforming cotton into the dominant cash crop of the 19th century American South. But at the time just after the Revolution, some still hoped slavery might gradually decline, especially since crops like tobacco were exhausting the soil. We will discuss the changes in slavery in a later section, but economically, the stage was being set for a north-south divergence, the North moving towards free labor and industry, the South doubling down on slave-based plantation agriculture. One must also note the government's role in Western lands as part of economic policy. Even under the Articles, Congress achieved a significant economic legislative feat with the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. These laws established an orderly process for surveying, selling, and governing Western territories, crucially important for revenue and growth. Under the Land Ordinance, the Western lands, ceded by states like Virginia to the national domain, were surveyed into townships and sections, then sold to settlers or speculators. This promised to bring income to the federal government and avoid the chaotic land grabbing that could lead to conflict. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, mentioned earlier, not only set up a model for how territories could become states, but also prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory and encouraged education and civil liberties in new communities. In the economic sense, the ordinance aimed to create stable property rights and encourage settlement by assuring new settlers they would have equal status to the old states once they formed states of their own. As the 1790s progressed, the federal government under the Constitution continued the policy of selling public lands, often in large tracts that favored land companies. But in 1796, Congress passed a new Land Act raising prices and the minimum purchase amount in an effort to increase revenue and discourage mere speculation. This actually slowed settlement because common farmers found the terms too expensive. In response, land laws would be adjusted in the 19th century to make smaller parcels available on credit. The push and pull of needing revenue versus promoting widespread land ownership was a constant theme. By the end of our period, say around 1800, the American economy had largely recovered from the immediate post-revolution slump. Historian estimates suggest that the Depression of the late 1770s to late 1780s saw GDP per capita drop significantly, but by 1790s growth had resumed. One Mount Vernon historian notes, for instance, that the economic depression of the 1780s was as severe in relative terms as the Great Depression of the 1930s, but the policies of the 1790s helped pull the nation out of it. However, ordinary people's experiences varied. A farmer in New Hampshire in 1798 might still recall the debt struggles of the 80s, but now benefiting from better prices for produce as trade revived. A merchant in Charleston could be growing rich exporting cotton and rice by 1800, whereas 10 years earlier he worried the ports might fail. And a young craftsman in Philadelphia might in 1795 find an apprenticeship in a growing workshop, where in 1785 there was little work. Perhaps most telling is that by the early 1800s, foreign observers were commenting on the rapid growth of American cities and the increase in standards of living, indicating a nation very much on the rise. The United States had transformed from a bankrupt collection of states to a country with a solid currency, functioning banks, and burgeoning trade. This economic stability was crucial in giving the new government credibility and the people a stake in the system's success. To be sure, many political battles were fundamentally about economics. Hamilton's plan, the Whiskey Rebellion, tariffs, demonstrating that economic policy was at the heart of shaping the post-revolution society. In quiet moments, perhaps an American farmer might not think of national credit or assumption of debt, but he would feel the difference if the market for his wheat improved or if the money he used held its value. By 1800, thanks to the policies of the 1790s, an American using a banknote from the Bank of the United States could trust its value, and an American ship sailing to London could obtain insurance and credit from merchants who trusted U.S. solvency. The fact that the economy did not collapse, but instead moved forward, was a vital sign that the new republic was succeeding. With the economy and political system on firmer ground, Americans could turn their eyes to the vast opportunities and challenges in front of them, literally in the case of the Western frontier. The next sections will delve into that frontier, how the new nation managed and expanded its territory, how it dealt with the Native American peoples who lived in those lands, and how the promise of Western expansion shaped the early republic's character. Westward expansion and the Northwest Territory. Even as the ink dried on the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which recognized American independence, a vast frontier beckoned. Britain's defeat meant the United States now claimed the land from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes in the north to Spanish Florida in the south. The western boundary of American settlement, long held at the Appalachian Mountains by British policy, the Proclamation of 1763, was now flung open. For many Americans, the post-revolution era meant the freedom to move westward, to seek new land and opportunity on the frontier. The lure of the West was powerful. Cheap or even free land, fertile soil, abundant game, and the adventure of new beginnings. However, westward expansion was complex and often violent. Those lands were not empty. They were homelands of numerous indigenous nations and also coveted by European powers, Britain in Canada and Spain in Louisiana and Florida. The story of the early republic's expansion is thus twofold: the orderly creation of new territorial governments and states under enlightened laws, and the darker saga of conflict and dispossession for Native Americans. We will explore both facets. Come first, consider the policy framework for expansion. Under the Articles of Confederation, as mentioned, Congress achieved a significant legislative success with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This law provided a model for how the United States would grow. New territories, rather than being subservient colonies, of the original states would go through stages of self-government and eventually enter the Union as equal states. 3 to 5 new states were envisioned out of the Northwest Territory, the area north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, encompassing future Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The ordinance outlined stages. Initially, a territory would have a governor and judges appointed by Congress. Once it had 5,000 free male inhabitants, it could elect an assembly, though the governor retained veto power. When the population reached 60,000 free inhabitants, it could draft a constitution and apply for statehood on equal footing with existing states. This blueprint was a remarkable commitment to the idea that the United States would not be an empire in the European sense. It would be a federation of co-equal states with a potentially unlimited western extent. Moreover, the Northwest Ordinance had forward-looking guarantees. It guaranteed freedom of religion, the right to trial by jury, and other civil liberties in the territory, foreshadowing a Bill of Rights at the territorial level. Education was encouraged, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The ordinance stated, setting aside land in each township for public schools. And crucially, slavery was prohibited in the Northwest Territory, a decision that would have long-term implications for the sectional balance between free and slave states. At the time, Southerners in Congress accepted this ban partly because they assumed the new states would be settled largely by migrants from the North or by Southern whites, who even if they couldn't bring slaves, would still likely align culturally with Southern interests. They also thought the fertile lands might be taken up by white settlers without slaves and still not become abolitionist hotbeds. Regardless of the reasoning, the Northwest Ordinance stands as one of the early republic's most significant laws, often called one of the organic laws of the United States. Hand in hand with governance was the matter of land distribution. The Land Ordinance of 1785 preceded the Northwest Ordinance and set up the cadastral land surveying system that continues to characterize much of the American Midwest today. Land was surveyed into square townships, 6 miles on a side, each divided into 36 sections of 1 square mile, 640 acres each. One section in each township was reserved to support public schools, a noteworthy commitment to education. The rest could be sold at auction with a minimum price set, initially $1 per acre, a hefty sum when 640-acre blocks were the minimum one could buy. Congress hoped land sales would both raise revenue and promote orderly settlement, preventing overlapping claims that had caused so much trouble in colonial days. While the high minimum acreage favored land companies and wealthy speculators at first, eventually policies would adjust to allow smaller plots and credit terms for average settlers. In practice, westward expansion in the 1780s and 1790s was a mix of planned and unplanned settlement. Thousands of settlers had already moved into Kentucky and Tennessee during and after the Revolution, territories which were not part of the Northwest Territory, but rather southern extensions. Kentucky was part of Virginia until becoming a state in 1792. Tennessee was North Carolina's western lands until becoming a U.S. territory in 1790 and a state in 1796. These areas saw a rush of pioneers lured by rich land. For example, Daniel Boone led settlers through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky even before independence. After the war, the flood of migrants grew. By 1790, Kentucky had over 70,000 people and would reach 220,000 by 1800, enough to be carved into a state. Tennessee's population likewise swelled. It was reported at around 35,000 in 1790 and over 105,000 by 1800. To the north, the Ohio country, future Ohio, was slower to populate due to the resistance of native confederacies and lack of immediate state-like status. But even so, by the late 1790s, settlement began in earnest after the military campaigns we will discuss shortly. Between 1783 and 1800, the population flow over the Appalachians was dramatic. The Trans-Appalachian West, the area roughly of the modern Midwest, and southeast beyond the original colonies, grew from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands. One contemporary figure claims that by 1810, over 1 million people lived west of the Appalachians, a trend that had its roots in the post-revolution rush. This massive movement inevitably brought frontier conflicts. The early United States faced a paradox. While Americans saw the West as the prize of independence, part of their heritage of liberty to be settled and farmed, the Native Americans saw the American expansion as a dire threat to their own liberty and way of life. During the Revolutionary War, many native tribes had allied with the British, who promised to protect their lands or at least halt colonial expansion. The British, upon making peace, ceded vast Indian territories to the U.S. without any consultation with those tribes. From the native perspective, the British betrayal was disastrous. Suddenly they were left to face the expanding Americans alone, with diminished European support. In the immediate post-war years, the United States tried diplomacy, albeit often coercive, to secure land cessions from tribes. The Confederation government negotiated treaties at Fort Stanwix, 1784, and Fort McIntosh, 1785, with fragments of the Iroquois and some Ohio tribes. These treaties some forced cessions of large tracts in New York, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio region under pressure, but many native leaders later repudiated them as not truly representative or fair. Indeed, the 6 nations of the Iroquois, especially the Mohawk and Seneca, were split and weakened. Some, like the Oneida, had sided with the Americans and got to keep small portions of land, while others who fought with the British found themselves dispossessed and compelled to relocate to Canada or to smaller reservations in New York. In the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois areas, a formidable pan-tribal resistance emerged. Tribes including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Lenape, Ottawa, Ojibwa, Chippewa, Potawatomi, and others formed a confederation determined to resist American encroachment. This collective, sometimes called the Western Confederacy, was inspired by earlier leaders like the Shawnee Chief Cornstalk, and now led by figures such as Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee. They had a clear goal: to defend the Ohio River as a boundary, keeping American settlers south and east of it. Indeed, they hoped the United States would recognize Indian sovereignty north of the Ohio. American settlers and many leaders, however, felt that victory over Britain entitled them to those lands. As settlers poured into the Ohio Valley, some illegally even before official land sales began, violence escalated. The U.S., under the Articles, struggled to deal with this. It lacked a standing army of note. In 1790, after the new federal government was in place, President Washington's administration decided to assert control. They sent an expedition under General Josiah Harmar to subdue the tribes in the Ohio country. Harmar's campaign failed. His forces were defeated in a series of skirmishes in 1790 by Confederacy warriors. The next year, 1791, saw a far more disastrous defeat. General Arthur St. Clair, then governor of the Northwest Territory, led the main U.S. Army force, around 1,400 men, into western Ohio. On November 4th, 1791, his force was ambushed and routed near the Wabash River in what is now Ohio by a native Confederacy force led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. St. Clair's defeat was catastrophic. Over 900 of his soldiers were killed or wounded, the worst loss the U.S. Army has ever suffered at the hands of Native Americans. It was a black day for the fledgling republic, far bloodier than Custer's famous defeat decades later. News of St. Clair's disaster shocked Philadelphia. Washington reportedly erupted in anger and worry. Congress launched an inquiry. There was a real fear that if left unchecked, the frontier war could destabilize the entire Northwest. The U.S. government responded by raising a new professional army, the Legion of the United States, commanded by General Mad Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War hero known for his boldness. Wayne took time to train his troops thoroughly. In 1794, he advanced methodically into Indian Territory, building forts along the way, Fort Recovery at the site of St. Clair's defeat, and Fort Greenville. The Native Confederacy, meanwhile, lost a potential ally when the British, worried about war with the U.S., signaled they would not openly support the tribes. Indeed, when Confederacy warriors sought munitions and safe harbor at a British fort during the climactic campaign, the British shut their gates. The showdown came in August 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near present-day Toledo, Ohio. Wayne's 3,000-strong force, which included regulars and Kentucky militia, decisively defeated about 1,500 native warriors. The battle site, littered with trees blown down by a storm, hence fallen timbers, saw a swift American charge that overwhelmed the Confederacy fighters. The British, as noted, did not come to the natives' aid, despite having a nearby fort. After this defeat, native resistance in the Northwest began to collapse. In 1795, Wayne was able to negotiate the Treaty of Greenville with a number of the tribes. Under this treaty, the tribes ceded a vast portion of present-day Ohio and parts of Indiana to the U.S., opening them to settlement. In exchange, they received goods valued at $20,000 and an annuity, annual payment of $9,500 in goods, and the promise of remaining lands being off-limits to white settlement. It was a major turning point. The Northwest Indian War, 1785-1795, ended, and the United States could enforce its sovereignty over the Northwest Territory. For the time being, a fragile peace held, though some native leaders like the Shawnee Tecumseh bitterly rejected Greenville and would renew resistance a decade later. With the Ohio country pacified and Britain, by Jay's Treaty of 1794, finally agreeing to evacuate its frontier forts on American soil, settlers poured in. By 1803, Ohio had enough population, over 60,000, to become the 17th state, the first state carved out of the Northwest Territory. The frontier that had been the haunt of war parties and isolated forts in 1790 was, by 1800, rapidly transforming into farmland, villages, and new towns like Cincinnati and Cleveland. As the PBS American Experience noted, Ohio grew from a handful of settlers into the fifth most populous state with 500,000 people by early in the 19th century. While that exact stat refers a bit later, By 1830, Ohio had $300,000. The growth in the immediate decades was explosive. Similarly, Tennessee and Kentucky, as new states, saw population booms, each well over 200,000 by 1800. In these new Western communities, life was rough but hopeful. Settlers often traveled by wagon or flatboat, whole families braving the wilderness to claim land. Many were young couples or Revolutionary War veterans claiming land grants given as payment for service. They built log cabins, cleared forests, and planted cornfields. The frontier ethos valued self-reliance, but also neighborly cooperation, as building a barn or defending against threat required communal effort. For instance, on the Kentucky and Tennessee frontier in the 1780s, conflicts with Cherokee factions like the Chickamauga, led by Dragging Canoe, required settlers to band together in stockades. But by the 1790s, those conflicts in the southern Appalachians eased through treaties like Hopewell, 1785, and the eventual defeat or accommodation of hostile bands. The Cumberland region, around Nashville, and bluegrass of Kentucky became relatively secure by 1794 onward, as native resistance in the immediate area subsided, and as the U.S. Army's victory in the North dissuaded pan-tribal coordination for a time. One cannot overstate the transformative impact of Western expansion on American society and identity. For many citizens, the West was a safety valve, a chance to start fresh if you struggled in the crowded East. This opportunity was mostly available to white settlers. For enslaved African Americans, being taken west often meant the expansion of bondage, especially into Kentucky, Tennessee, and later territories like Mississippi. For Native Americans, it spelled an accelerating loss of land and autonomy. The U.S. government, even as it made treaties, often failed to enforce settlers respecting those treaties. After the Treaty of Greenville, for example, some lands were guaranteed to tribes, but within a few years pressure mounted to cede more. The pattern of treaty, settlement, encroachment, and renewed treaty would repeat again and again, always pushing native peoples further west or into reservations. The early republic did have a stated policy of dealing with tribes via treaties, recognizing them as nations with whom the U.S. made agreements. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance even stated, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent." Fine words, but in reality consent was manufactured or coerced, and good faith was often lacking. Still, the treaty-making era established then would last into the 1870s and is a key part of post-revolution relations with indigenous nations. Washington and his Secretary of War Henry Knox had a vision of civilizing the tribes, encouraging them to adopt agriculture and private property, which they thought would make coexistence possible. But even that paternalistic vision foundered on settlers' insatiable hunger for land. From a narrative standpoint, imagine a scene in the 1790s on the Ohio frontier. A pioneer family clears land near a broad river. At twilight, the forest around is still and uneasy, the memory of conflict lingering. Yet by the family's cabin, there is the warm glow of the hearth. Neighbors a few miles off gather at a new hamlet that boasts a tavern and a mill by the stream. They talk of roads being cut and perhaps a schoolmaster arriving by next spring. What once was Indian hunting ground is becoming the old Northwest of American settlement. One settler writes back east, marveling that in just 5 years, farms and villages rise where recently only wilderness reigned. There is a sense of manifest destiny, not yet the term, but the feeling that the land is theirs to tame and improve, a continuation of the revolution's promise of liberty and property. Yet also picture a council fire in a Shawnee or Miami village after fallen timbers. Grief and anger grip those who fought. A venerable chief maybe stands and says, "We fought for every inch of land. Now we must make peace or be destroyed." Younger warriors like Tecumseh stalk away, refusing to touch the American gifts at Greenville, vowing that one day they'll form a stronger confederacy to resist further loss. The revolution and its aftermath were, for them, an unmitigated catastrophe. They went from key power brokers balanced between Britain and the U.S. to dispossessed refugees in their own homeland within a span of 20 years. As one British officer observing later said, "American independence has been the heaviest blow to the natives of North America, because it unleashed the full tide of settlers. One factor easing expansion was the resolution of international issues regarding the West. Spain controlled the Mississippi River's mouth at New Orleans and could bottle up Western commerce. The frontier settlers, especially in Kentucky and Tennessee, depended on floating their produce, barrels of flour, tobacco, pork, etc., down the Ohio and Mississippi to rich markets. For a while, Spain closed the Mississippi to American goods in the 1780s, causing outrage and even whispers that Westerners might secede or join Spain if they couldn't get an outlet for trade. This problem was joyously resolved with the Pinckney's Treaty of San Lorenzo, in 1795, whereby Spain granted Americans free navigation of the Mississippi and the right of deposit in New Orleans. This diplomatic victory by Thomas Pinckney removed a huge obstacle to Western growth. The settlers could get their goods to international markets, and thus farming in Ohio or Tennessee could be profitable. It also set the southern boundary at the 31st parallel, clarifying that the U.S. southern border, was at Florida's edge, since Spain ceded its claim to what is now northern Alabama and Mississippi. With Spain on friendlier terms and Britain pulling back after Jay's Treaty, the West truly became the national domain of the U.S., uncontested by foreign powers, at least until one headed by Napoleon would briefly re-enter the picture, with the Louisiana retrocession from Spain in 1800, unknown to Americans until a bit later, but culminating in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. As settlers moved, new territories formed. Congress organized the Southwest Territory for lands south of the Ohio that weren't yet states, basically present Tennessee, in 1790 under Governor William Blount, leading to Tennessee's admission in 1796. Mississippi Territory was organized in 1798 from the Georgia Cession, covering future Mississippi and Alabama. Each step expanded the Empire of Liberty, as Jefferson called it, meaning a republican political order spreading over more space. The new Western communities often carried democratic tendencies even further. Many frontier folk had little patience for aristocracy or deference. They demanded more voice in their local governance. This contributed to the push for states like Kentucky and Tennessee to have more liberal constitutions, e.g., Kentucky's 1792 Constitution had universal white male suffrage without property tests, more expansive than many eastern states at the time. The frontier was a leveler in some ways. Everyone had to work to clear fields, and old class distinctions meant less. Life remained harsh. Frontier settlers often lived in rudimentary conditions: dirt floors, log walls, homemade furniture. They faced threats from nature: wild animals, harsh winters, and distance from markets. But as the 1790s turned to 1800, the frontier was increasingly dotted with signs of permanence. Courthouses, churches, circuit-riding preachers were spreading the Second Great Awakening soon, and newspapers. For example, newspapers appeared in Lexington, Kentucky, as early as 1787, the Kentucky Gazette, showing that even beyond the mountains, American civic life took root quickly. By closing this section, we see that Western expansion after the Revolution was rapid and defining. The population growth and new states formed changed the balance of the nation, ensuring that the U.S. would not remain a small strip of Atlantic states, but an expanding continental republic. In 1789, the nation had 13 states. By 1800, there were 16, with Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee added. Territories were waiting in the wings to become more. This growth fulfilled for many the revolutionary promise of opportunity. As one veteran, upon claiming land in Ohio, wrote, "Here I have my own land to plow, under my own liberty." This was the freedom we fought for. Yet it was a freedom that came at the profound expense of native peoples, a tragic undercurrent to the triumphal frontier narrative. Next, we will turn to another profound issue of the post-revolution period, one entwined with both the ideals of the revolution and the realities of the new nation's society: slavery and the early anti-slavery movement. How did the revolution's rhetoric of liberty impact the institution of slavery? What changes, if any, occurred in the status of enslaved African Americans and in the national approach to slavery in the aftermath of independence? Slavery and early abolition efforts. In 1776, the American colonies declared that all men are created equal with an inherent right to liberty, stirring words that inspired a revolution. Yet at that very moment, hundreds of thousands of African Americans remained in bondage in those colonies, held as property by many of the very leaders who proclaimed universal rights. The contradiction between revolutionary ideals and the reality of slavery was glaring. How would the new United States reconcile, or fail to reconcile, this tension in the post-revolutionary era? The period after the Revolution saw both significant changes in the institution of slavery and the entrenchment of a tragic divide that would eventually lead to civil war. It was a time of both hope and setback for African Americans, as the first anti-slavery movements gathered strength and some northern states took steps to abolish the practice, while the southern economy became increasingly dependent on slave labor. During the Revolutionary War, enslaved people seized on the tumult to pursue freedom. Thousands fled their enslavers to join British lines after the British offered emancipation to those who would fight for the crown, as in Lord Dunmore's proclamation of 1775 in Virginia. By war's end, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 African Americans had escaped, died, or been evacuated with the British. Indeed, in 1783, when the British evacuated New York, they took many black loyalists to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or England, refusing American slaveholders' demands to return what they saw as property. In one striking outcome, about 1,200 black loyalists from Nova Scotia later emigrated to Sierra Leone in West Africa in 1792, seeking a land of true freedom. Thus, one irony of the American Revolution is that it immediately liberated significant numbers of slaves, but through British action and to places outside the new United States. Within the United States after independence, the status of slavery began to diverge sharply by region. In the northern states, where slavery was less economically central, a wave of abolitionist sentiment and new laws gradually took effect. Pennsylvania, influenced by Quaker anti-slavery beliefs and the Enlightenment, enacted the first broad abolition law in 1780, the Gradual Abolition Act. This law declared that no new slaves could be imported, and that children born to enslaved mothers in Pennsylvania after the act would be free at age 28. It was a gradual emancipation approach, meaning existing enslaved individuals remained in bondage for life, unless freed by their owners. But slavery would phase out over time as the older generation passed on and the young reached majority as free. Pennsylvania's law was cautious to appease slaveholders, but it set a precedent. Following Pennsylvania, Massachusetts moved toward abolition in a different way. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 declared that all men are born free and equal. In 1783, an enslaved man named Quack Walker sued for his freedom under that constitution, and the state's Supreme Judicial Court agreed that slavery was incompatible with the new constitution. Thus, Massachusetts effectively abolished slavery outright by judicial decision. Similarly, the few enslaved people in New Hampshire gained freedom around 1783 and 1784 via court cases and a constitutional interpretation, though the process was less formal. Connecticut and Rhode Island passed gradual emancipation laws in 1784, similar to Pennsylvania's model. Rhode Island's law, for instance, freed children born after March 1784, girls at 18, boys at 21, and forbade the importation of slaves. New York and New Jersey, where slavery was more prevalent, took longer but eventually followed. New York passed a gradual emancipation law in 1799, freeing children of slaves born after July 4th of that year, once males reached 28 and females 25. And New Jersey in 1804, with a similar approach, freeing males at 25, females at 21 for those born after the act. These northern laws often left a generation of older enslaved people in servitude until death, but they decisively put slavery on the path to extinction above the Mason-Dixon line and Ohio River. By 1804, every northern state had provided for the abolition of slavery, either immediately or gradually. This was a revolutionary change compared to 1775, when slavery had been legal in all 13 colonies. It's important to note that gradual emancipation was indeed gradual. In New Jersey, the last slaves, born before 1804, weren't fully free until the 1860s. Even in 1840, New Jersey still had a small number of apprentices for life, a euphemism to circumvent calling them slaves. But the legal framework was set for a free North. The free black population in the North grew steadily. Many of those freed formed communities, churches, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded by Richard Allen in Philadelphia in 1794, and mutual aid societies. Northern states also usually banned the slave trade and any new enslaved persons from being brought in. As early as 1777, Vermont, which declared independence from Britain and functioned as a republic before joining the Union in 1791, outlawed slavery in its constitution, the first polity in America to do so. The Chesapeake states, Maryland and Virginia, saw mixed trends. On one hand, economic changes made the old tobacco plantation model less profitable by the 1790s. Some planters began diversifying crops or found themselves with excess slaves. Influenced by revolutionary ideals or evangelical religion, a number of slaveholders chose to free their slaves, a practice known as manumission. Virginia in 1782 passed a law allowing slave owners to manumit slaves by will or deed without requiring a special legislative act, which had earlier been needed. Thousands of enslaved Virginians gained freedom in the 1780s and 1790s as a result. In fact, the proportion of free blacks in Virginia's black population rose significantly. By 1810, over 7% of Virginia's black people were free, up from almost none before the war. Notably, George Washington, upon his death in 1799, left a will that provided for the emancipation of his enslaved workers, some 123 people, upon the death of his wife, Martha. Washington also stipulated the young and infirm be taken care of, and children taught to read and write. Martha Washington, uncomfortable with the arrangement, some say fearing these people might wish to hasten her death to gain freedom, freed Washington's slaves early in 1801. Washington's action was unique among major founders from the South. Thomas Jefferson, for all his rhetoric, only freed a few individuals, mostly members of the Hemmings family, in his will, and even that was unusual. Jefferson did, however, advocate in theory for a plan of gradual emancipation coupled with expatriation, sending freed people out of the country, reflecting the common view among many whites that a large free black population in the U.S. was undesirable due to ingrained prejudices. In Maryland, several Protestant evangelical movements urged manumission, and the number of free black people grew there as well. By 1810, a substantial free black community thrived in Baltimore. Delaware, with a relatively small number of slaves, saw slavery decline to the point that by 1810 the majority of blacks in Delaware were free, even though no abolition law was ever passed. It just withered through manumission and sales out of state. The Deep South, the Carolinas, and Georgia was a different story. During the war, the British evacuation had carried away many South Carolina and Georgia slaves, some to freedom, some sold in the West Indies, so those states had a slight decrease in enslaved population by 1783. But soon after, they reopened their slave trade. Georgia, which had temporarily banned import during the war, reopened it in 1787 and began expanding plantation agriculture, rice in the Low Country, and crucially by the late 1790s, cotton in the uplands. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney dramatically increased the efficiency of cotton processing, making short staple cotton, which could grow in the interior uplands, profitable. Almost immediately, the Deep South was on a path to expand slavery rather than reduce it. In the 1790s, Georgia even distributed some land by lottery to spur cotton farming, and with it came a surge in demand for enslaved labor. The internal slave trade, from the older Chesapeake to the newer southern frontier, was beginning by 1800 and would accelerate after 1808 when the international slave trade was finally closed by law. It is worth mentioning the Constitution's compromises on slavery in 1787 as they framed the early national policy. Three key provisions. The 3/5 clause, each enslaved person counted as 3/5 of a person for representation in Congress and taxation, giving slave-holding states more political power than they would have had counting only free persons. The Fugitive Slave Clause, requiring that enslaved people who escaped to free states be returned to their owners on the theory they remained property, and the Slave Trade Clause, which forbade Congress from banning the importation of slaves before 1808, though a tax could be imposed on each person imported. These clauses were products of intense debate. Some Northerners wanted immediate action against slavery, or at least against the slave trade. Southerners threatened to scuttle the Union if slavery was touched. The compromise was to tolerate slavery where it existed and put off the slave trade issue. Come January 1st, 1808, Congress did pass a law banning the importation of slaves. President Jefferson signed it as soon as it was constitutionally permitted. This ended the legal transatlantic slave trade for the U.S., although smuggling continued on a small scale. By that time, the domestic slave population was self-reproducing and even growing, so the South was not starved of labor by the ban. Instead, it led to the expansion of an internal trade from the older states to newer ones. Socially and intellectually, the Revolution did ignite a spirit that questioned slavery. Many Americans, even some slaveholders, experienced a moral unease. The language of natural rights was difficult to confine just to white men. Anti-slavery societies were formed. The first was the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, founded in its reconstituted form in 1787 with Benjamin Franklin as its president. Similar societies appeared in New York, Rhode Island, Maryland, and even Virginia. These groups engaged in petitioning, legal assistance for free blacks, and public education campaigns. In 1790, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society sent a petition to the first Congress, signed by Franklin, urging Congress to use its powers to step to the very verge of those allowed by the Constitution to limit slavery, and especially the slave trade. This petition and others, including from Quakers, sparked the first debate over slavery in Congress. The matter was sensitive. Southern congressmen reacted with outrage to any discussion of interfering with slavery, citing the Constitution's protection of it. After heated exchanges, Congress agreed to a compromise resolution basically stating Congress had no authority to abolish slavery where it existed under state law, and that it would not consider any action on the trade until 1808, as the Constitution specified. In essence, they tabled the issue. Franklin, in one of his last public acts, wrote a satirical response under a pseudonym, mocking the arguments of a pro-slavery speaker by mimicking them as if coming from a North African pirate, justifying enslaving Christians. Franklin died in 1790, disappointed that more hadn't been done. Nonetheless, the very fact Congress debated the issue was notable. During the 1790s, abolitionist sentiment continued among some churches and thinkers. The Methodist and Baptist churches, which were growing rapidly on the frontier and among common folk, initially took strong stances against slavery, though they would later compromise in the South. The Northwest Ordinance's ban on slavery in new territories north of the Ohio was a conscious decision to prevent the spread of the institution. Some founders, like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, were opposed to slavery, Adams on moral grounds, though his Massachusetts had none to deal with, Hamilton possibly in part from personal inclination and belief in free labor, although he did marry into a slave-holding family. Even in Virginia, we have individuals like George Mason who condemned slavery's effects. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant, he said, but paradoxically did not free his own. And Patrick Henry, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," admitted it was hypocritical for him to own slaves, yet he said he couldn't figure out what to do with them if freed. The early republic also saw the first stirrings of colonization schemes, the idea of freeing slaves and resettling them in Africa or elsewhere. This was not mainstream yet, but in 1790s, a few ex-slaves like Paul Cuff, a black businessman in Massachusetts, advocated for migration of black people to Africa, and white thinkers toyed with it. That idea would grow by 1816 with the American Colonization Society. While the North progressed toward emancipation, the enslaved populations in the South actually grew, from about 700,000 in 1790 to over 890,000 in 1800 and nearly 1.2 million by 1810, thanks to natural increase and the importation of slaves up to 1808. Slavery was becoming even more entrenched on the southern landscape with the rise of King Cotton. Any hopes that the Upper South's moves toward manumission would snowball into widespread emancipation were dashed by the economic turn. In fact, after the Haitian Revolution, 1791-1804, where enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up and eventually achieved independence, creating the black-led Republic of Haiti, fear of slave insurrections gripped Southern whites. The Haiti example, at first cheered by some Americans when it seemed to align with French revolutionary ideals, became terrifying to slaveholders once the violence and racial aspect were clear. This led to harsher laws in the South. For example, Virginia in 1806 passed a law that any slave freed henceforth had to leave the state within 1 year or face re-enslavement, a way to discourage manumission and remove free black people seen as potential instigators. Other states implemented similar restrictions. The door that had opened a crack in the 1780s for voluntary emancipation began to close as the decades turned. In the lives of black Americans themselves, the post-revolution era was a mix of achievement and struggle. Free black communities emerged, particularly in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. Pioneering individuals such as Prince Hall in Boston, who founded African American Freemasonry in 1795 and campaigned for black education and against the slave trade, or James Forten in Philadelphia, a wealthy black sailmaker who funded abolitionist causes, represented a new class of black leaders. In 1797, Prince Hall petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for funds to educate black children. Though unsuccessful, it was an early call for equal education. Newspapers like Freedom's Journal would be founded by free blacks, a bit later in 1827, but building on a tradition of pamphleteering that early black writers engaged in. One remarkable document of the era is Letters from an American Farmer, 1782, by J. Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, which asked, "What is an American?" and praised the new society, but also notably included a horrified description of a slave being left to die in a cage, as seen in the South, showing an Enlightenment observer's disgust at slavery's brutality. To illustrate the sentiments, Abigail Adams, in one of her letters, expressed a hope that slavery would be abolished, calling it a sin. Thomas Jefferson, in his Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785, wrote that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go, acknowledging the dilemma but not resolving it. He predicted that God's justice would not sleep forever, a prescient if ominous warning. Yet Jefferson himself, as noted, did not take legislative action for emancipation in Virginia when he perhaps could have influenced it in the 1770s-80s. His anti-slavery words ring hollow to many given his personal practice. Looking at early federal policy, aside from the Northwest Ordinance and the eventual closing of the slave trade, the federal government did abolish slavery in at least one domain, the nation's capital, though that came later in 1862. In our period, one key event was in 1794. Congress passed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which outlawed American citizens' participation in the international slave trade to other nations. This was partly to stop people from fitting out slave voyages from U.S. ports to places like Cuba, or carrying French slaves around during the French Revolutionary Wars, a precursor to the full ban in 1808. The interplay of slavery and the new Constitution also had political ramifications. Southern representation in Congress was bolstered by the 315 Clause, affecting the balance of power. Some Northerners referred bitterly to the slave power as early as the 1790s, when Virginia and other Southern states had outsized influence in the House and Electoral College because of their enslaved populations counting toward seats. In recounting this era in a gentle narrative manner, we might envision scenes such as Xerxes. Philadelphia in 1790, a group of Quakers and dignitaries, like Benjamin Franklin, gather by candlelight drafting their petition to Congress, their voices low but earnest, hoping to steer the young nation's conscience. We might picture a young enslaved man in Maryland listening intently as traveling Methodist preachers speak of all men equal before God, and that man daring to dream that freedom might be possible, or a New England town meeting where citizens vote that their delegates in the state legislature should push for abolition, influenced by the atmosphere of liberty. We should also mention one early slave rebellion conspiracy, Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800 in Virginia. Though technically just outside our 1780s-90s time frame, it was rooted in post-revolution currents. Gabriel, an enslaved blacksmith near Richmond, plotted a large uprising for August 1800, inspired by the rhetoric of freedom and likely news of Haiti and the egalitarian talk of the day. The plot was foiled by rain and informants. Some 26 conspirators were hanged. This had a chilling effect on any move toward emancipation in Virginia, convincing many whites that educating or freeing slaves would lead to insurrection. Thomas Jefferson, by then president, even was aware of the scare. Ironically, Gabriel originally timed the rebellion for when Jefferson would be in Richmond, possibly hoping to negotiate with someone who had written so much about liberty. By 1800, the nation was clearly divided into free and slave sections in a way that would harden. Northern states had either eliminated or were eliminating slavery, and a growing cadre of free black citizens there exercised some rights, though often limited by property or other restrictions on voting, and faced discrimination. Southern states had doubled down on slavery as their economic backbone and grew more defensive of the institution. Many at the time believed slavery in the Upper South might slowly fade, which it didn't fully, due to cotton's influence reaching even North Carolina and Virginia, with new cash crops like cotton and sugar later. The battle lines of ideology were drawn, a Mason-Dixon line dividing two social systems. In summary, the decades after the American Revolution saw the first significant crack in the foundation of slavery. The moral and legal challenge to it gained ground in the North and in the minds of some in the South. Yet simultaneously, Slavery expanded westward and strengthened in the South, setting the stage for future conflicts. As Dr. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia abolitionist and signer of the Declaration, observed with hope in 1787, the American War is over. But this is far from being the case with the American Revolution, implying the Revolution's principles were still to be achieved on issues like slavery and equality. The progress and regress on slavery were part of that ongoing revolutionary struggle for a society that lived up to its stated ideals. Having discussed the political, economic, territorial, and social changes, including slavery, we should also examine the role and status of women after the Revolution and the cultural shifts in ideas, education, and national identity that characterized this era. The Revolution had affected women's lives in various ways. Now, in the new nation, how were women's rights and roles conceived? And how did American culture begin to develop in terms of arts, literature, and a shared national identity? We will now explore the experiences of women in the early republic and the broader cultural transformations of the time. Women in the post-revolutionary United States, Republican motherhood, and limited change. During the American Revolution, women had actively contributed to the patriot cause, managing farms and shops in men's absence, making homespun cloth to boycott British goods, serving as messengers, or even disguising as soldiers, and raising funds for the Continental Army, as with Philadelphia's Ladies Association, led by Esther Reed. They tasted a form of empowerment and patriotic engagement. In the war's aftermath, there was a subtle shift in how women's role in the new society was envisioned. While the Revolution did not grant women legal or political equality, it did spur discussion about women's education and their place in the Republic. The prevailing concept that emerged was known as Republican motherhood, the idea that women had the vital responsibility of raising and educating the next generation of citizens and leaders. This gave a new dignity and importance to women's domestic role, even as it reinforced that their sphere was primarily home and family. Before the Revolution, women's educational opportunities were very limited. Most girls received only basic instruction in reading, enough to read the Bible perhaps, and domestic skills. The notion that a woman should be knowledgeable beyond household arts was often dismissed. But the success of the Revolution and the survival of the Republic seemed to depend on an informed, virtuous citizenry. Americans began to argue that if citizens' sons must be virtuous and informed, then who better to nurture those qualities early on than mothers? As Reverend Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration, wrote in 1787 in his essay Thoughts Upon Female Education, women needed to be educated in the principles of liberty and government so they could instruct their sons in the principles of liberty and government. This wasn't advocacy for women's political rights, but for their education as a means to bolster the Republic. Under the banner of Republican motherhood, women's literacy rates in the North especially began to climb in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By 1840, literacy among women in New England was nearly universal, whereas in 1780, only about half of New England's women could sign their names. This remarkable increase had its seeds in the post-revolution era, when female academies were founded and attitudes slowly shifted in favor of women's schooling. For example, academies for girls such as the Young Ladies Academy of Philadelphia, founded 1787, appeared, one of the first American chartered schools for girls. Emma Willard and others would soon open female seminaries in the early 1800s, building on this momentum. Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary opened in 1821, a bit later, but part of this continuum. Mary Wollstonecraft's 1792 work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, also influenced American thinkers. Wollstonecraft argued for women's education and described how a nation's progress was tied to treating women as rational beings. Excerpts from her work circulated in the U.S., reinforcing calls for better schooling for women. So, in a typical American town around 1800, one might see modest changes. A few more girls going to school, learning not only sewing and music, the usual accomplishments, but also reading, writing, maybe even basics of geography and history. Mothers, in theory, could now guide their children's intellectual and moral development more effectively. What didn't change much was women's legal status. In the eyes of the law, married women were still under the doctrine of coverture, meaning a woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. She generally could not own property separately, make contracts, or vote. Single women and widows had more rights. They could own property, for instance, which is why many early women writers and business owners were widowed or never married. The Revolution had produced some stirrings of advocacy. Abigail Adams famously wrote to John Adams in 1776, urging him to remember the ladies when making new laws, warning that if women were not given a voice, they might foment a rebellion against arbitrary male power. John Adams responded lightly, jokingly dismissing such saucy ideas. This exchange encapsulates how even sympathetic men, John adored Abigail's intellect, were not prepared to truly enfranchise women. One notable, if short-lived political opportunity for women occurred in New Jersey. New Jersey's 1776 state constitution had vaguely allowed suffrage to all inhabitants with a certain amount of property. The intent was probably to allow property-holding unmarried women, widows, spinsters, to vote. As a result, for a brief period up to 1807, some women and free black property holders did vote in New Jersey elections. Newspapers from the 1790s in New Jersey mention women voting, particularly widows or single women of property. However, in 1807, the state legislature, alarmed by some electoral shenanigans and probably uncomfortable with women at polls, explicitly restricted suffrage to white males, ending that experiment. It would take over a century before women gained the vote again nationwide. Despite these limitations, post-revolution America did produce women of remarkable intellect and influence. Mercy Otis Warren of Massachusetts, who had written anti-British plays during the war, authored one of the first histories of the American Revolution in 1805. Judith Sargent Murray, a writer from Massachusetts, penned the 1790 essay on the equality of the sexes, arguing that women's minds were as good as men's if given equal education. She championed the idea that any observed intellectual inferiority was due to women's lack of schooling, not innate ability. Her essays, under pseudonyms, appeared in New England magazines and were influential among early feminist thinkers. These women were early voices for gender equality, even if their impact was limited to educated circles. In daily life, for most women, especially on farms or the frontier. The revolution's aftermath did not dramatically alter their duties. They continued to run households, produce food, spin, and weave cloth, though by 1800 cheap British cloth was back on the market, relieving some of the need for homespun that women had heroically taken up during the boycotts. But there was perhaps a new respect accorded to their role. Women were seen as the custodians of American values in the home. A certain iconography developed of liberty as a woman, or of America as Columbia, a female figure, paradoxically elevating the feminine symbolically, while real women lacked political rights. The narrative of a gentle knight might describe a mother teaching her children stories of patriotic heroes by the fireside, instilling virtue. One might imagine Eliza Lucas Pinckney in South Carolina. Before war, she innovated indigo cultivation, now writing letters advising her sons on public service. Or Abigail Adams, managing the family farm in Quincy, while corresponding insightfully with national leaders. Women engaged in a lot of letter writing and informal influence. They formed an important part of the Republic of Letters. For instance, the popular reading choices for women included history and literature. The first American novels, like Hannah Webster Foster's The Coquette, yet 1797, or Susanna Rowson's Charlotte Temple, 1791, were widely read by women and often contained moral lessons aligning with Republican values, virtue, cautionary tales about transgression. Economic roles for women remained limited to mostly traditional female-dominated occupations like seamstress, midwife, teacher. Later on, teaching would become a big avenue for educated women. Indeed, the push for female education also quietly prepared a workforce of teachers for the expanding nation's schools. By the mid-1800s, women were a majority of teachers, but that's ahead of our time. During the 1790s, the first stirrings of industrialization, textile mills offered young unmarried women in places like New England a chance to work outside the home in the coming decades, the Lowell Mill girls of the 1820s. But circa 1800, that was just at the very start. Culturally, it's important to note women's influence in religion. The Second Great Awakening, which began around 1790s on a small scale, saw women as key participants in revivals, prayer meetings, etc. This period saw formation of some of the first female charitable societies, church auxiliaries, help for the poor, etc., a sphere of activism deemed acceptable for women since it fit the nurturing role. One extraordinary case of the era was Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman in Boston who became a renowned poet in the 1770s. By the post-war period, she was freed in 1778, and continued to write until her death in 1784. Wheatley's existence and acclaim challenged assumptions about race and gender capacities. She corresponded with Washington and the other leaders, a symbol of black and female literary achievement. However, after the Revolution, there was also a re-entrenchment in some ways of traditional roles. Some historians argue that the concept of Republican motherhood, while seemingly positive, actually circumscribed women's sphere firmly to the home and indirectly discouraged pushes for broader women's rights by saying motherhood in itself was a patriotic contribution, thus no need for women to vote or work outside the home. Their raising of sons and support of husbands was the contribution. It would be over a century before the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, declared women's political equality. In education, though, the gains were real. By 1790, female literacy was improving, and women like Sarah Pierce had established schools. Pierce opened the Litchfield Female Academy in Connecticut in 1792. These educated women then raised educated daughters, creating a legacy of smart, civically aware women who in the 19th century would become the ones to lead movements like abolition and women's suffrage. Indeed, historians like Linda Kerber have drawn a line from Republican motherhood to the early women's rights advocates. Having been taught that they were guardians of virtue, women took that as authority to speak on moral and social issues outside the home, like abolition and temperance. One cannot talk about women without touching on women's legal and property rights. While married women had few rights, some states did modify laws slightly. New Jersey's initial suffrage aside, some states made it easier for women to conduct business if husbands were incapacitated, etc. But mostly, reforms in women's property rights, like Married Women's Property Acts, didn't come until much later, mid-1800s. In A Calm Night's Narrative, one might portray a conversation between a mother and daughter. The mother explains how she learned to read using the Bible and the Ladies' Magazine, and now she's ensuring her daughter reads Franklin's Almanac and maybe history books so that she will be fitted to be the wife of a free citizen and the mother of good Republicans. The daughter shyly reads a copy of The Rights of Woman hidden under her embroidery, dreaming of attending one of those new academies. Overall, the revolution opened intellectual doors for women. With talk of equal natural rights, some began to question their own subordination, but societal change was slow. As a famous line from Abigail Adams's letter goes, men would be tyrants if they could, implying that without legal change, women remained under male authority. And indeed, for decades they would, despite the revolution's egalitarian promise. Having considered women's role, we should finally zoom out to the broader cultural shifts and national identity in the post-revolutionary United States. This was a time of building a national culture. Symbols, press, literature, education, and that nebulous but important feeling of Americanness over colonial or state identity. We've touched on aspects of this throughout: the growth of the free press, early literature, changes in social hierarchy. But let us address it directly to round out the portrait of post-revolutionary life, cultural shifts, and national identity in the new republic. In the decades following independence, Americans gradually began to see themselves not as provincials of 13 separate colonies, but as citizens of a common nation. This transformation in identity was subtle and slow, yet palpable. The Revolution had done more than sever ties to Britain. It sparked the creation of a distinct American culture. People started speaking of the United States in the singular, the nation is rather than are, reflecting a growing unity. A visitor in the 1790s might observe that Americans of different states shared increasingly similar fashions, read the same newspapers and novels, and celebrated common national holidays like the 4th of July with pride. One key factor in shaping national identity was the proliferation of newspapers and the robust freedom of the press. By the 1790s, the American press had exploded in quantity and partisanship. As mentioned, about 100 newspapers existed by 1790 across the states, and that number grew into the hundreds in the early 1800s. These papers, like Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette in earlier days, or the Gazette of the United States and National Gazette in the 1790s, connected Americans to debates in far-off capitals and spread information about national issues. Printers and editors became influential figures. For example, Philip Freneau's National Gazette championed Jeffersonian ideas, while John Fenno's Gazette of the United States promoted Federalist causes. The press in this era was unabashedly partisan, often printing scathing personal attacks, which led to Federalists passing the Sedition Act of 1798 to punish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. Despite occasional legal crackdowns, a vibrant press culture took root, reinforcing the concept that public opinion mattered in the new republic. Literature and arts also contributed to a sense of American identity. Early on, Noah Webster, a Connecticut schoolmaster, argued that America must have its own language and textbooks, not rely on British imports. He compiled American dictionaries and spellers. Webster's blue-backed speller, first published 1783, taught children not just how to read, but subtly instilled patriotic lessons through example sentences. For instance, Webster removed British spelling quirks, favor, and included American geography and history in his materials. Many a child learned to read from Webster's speller, making it a unifying cultural artifact. By 1806, Webster published an early dictionary, further differentiating American English. American literature in the 1780s-90s remained influenced by European styles, but certain works captured the American scene. William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, 1789, is considered the first American novel, a tale warning of seduction and ruin. Charles Brockden Brown wrote some of the first American Gothic novels in the 1790s, like Wieland, 1798, using American settings. Poets like Philip Freneau, the poet of the American Revolution, wrote verses celebrating American scenery and democratic spirit. There was a thirst for cultural independence to match political independence. A notable attempt to create a national epic was Joel Barlow's The Columbiad, 1807, a grand poem about America, though it's a bit beyond 1800. Barlow earlier wrote The Vision of Columbus in 1787, which he expanded into the Columbiads later, envisioning a glorious future for America. Barlow was part of the Hartford Wits, a group of Connecticut literati trying to forge an American high culture. The visual arts also began to shape national identity. Painters like John Trumbull, a veteran of the war, created historical paintings. He painted scenes like the signing of the Declaration and Washington resigning his commission. These images, later hung in the U.S. Capitol, gave Americans visual icons of their founding moments. Charles Willson Peale, a painter from Philadelphia, not only produced portraits of Revolution heroes, Washington, Jefferson, etc., but also founded one of America's first museums, Peale's Museum in Philadelphia, where he displayed not just art, but also scientific curiosities, like mastodon bones, promoting the idea that America had its own natural wonders and history. Symbols and rituals emerged. The bald eagle was adopted as the national emblem in 1782, replacing the old allegiances to the British lion or such. The Great Seal of the United States, with its eagle and Latin mottos, a pluribus unum, out of many one, was widely reproduced, reinforcing unity. The new national flag, with its stripes and stars, became a potent symbol. By the 1790s, Americans celebrated Flag Day, not official yet, but the flag was revered especially after surviving British bombardment in 1814, the origin of the Star-Spangled Banner poem, a bit later. The 4th of July was celebrated every year with toasts, speeches, militia drills, and sometimes rowdy festivities, a kind of patriotic glue across states. Towns would read the Declaration aloud, and newspapers printed reports of similar celebrations in other cities, building a feeling that we all commemorate this day together. National unity was still a work in progress. Early on, there was lingering loyalty primarily to one state or region, but several factors fostered unity. One was the leadership of figures like George Washington. His farewell address in 1796 made an emotional appeal to national unity, urging Americans to consider themselves a band of brethren with a common cause. Washington's tours of the country, he visited New England in 1789, the South in 1791, were like a living symbol of the nation binding its sections. People who saw him felt connected to the national government personally. Another factor, the shared memory of the war. Veterans of different states felt a bond, and as early as 1783, organizations like the Society of the Cincinnati, a fraternity of officers from the Revolution, formed, transcending state lines, though it had critics who feared it was an aristocratic club. Still, stories of Valley Forge or Yorktown were national lore. Interestingly, after the war, American society shed some aristocratic pretensions. The PBS article noted that the distinction of gentleman was fading. Most men were now called citizen or simply Mr. In an atmosphere of egalitarianism, titles of nobility were outlawed by state constitutions and the U.S. Constitution. The Revolution leveled social hierarchies somewhat, though not entirely. There was more respect for labor, the idea that in America, unlike in Europe, it was not disgraceful for a gentleman to work. Holding an occupation became a mark of respect rather than shame. This fed the national self-image of Americans as practical, industrious, and free of old-world class snobbery. Religious freedom and diversity became a feature of American identity too, in contrast with established churches in Europe. The Revolution saw the disestablishment of the Anglican Church in states like Virginia, Statute of Religious Freedom in 1786, and generally more tolerance. The First Amendment, 1791, enshrined that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Many Americans took pride in this liberty of conscience, viewing it as part of what made religion flourish on voluntary faith rather than government decree. New sects like the Methodists and Baptists grew rapidly after the Revolution, further eroding old provincial identities and knitting people together through shared faith experiences across state lines. By 1800, a nascent sense of American nationalism was undeniably present. Travelers noted that Americans, for all their regional differences, shared a certain pride in their experiment in self-government. When news of European conflicts came, Americans increasingly contrasted the tyranny or turmoil of the Old World with their own republican virtue and stability. School books and sermons alike reminded citizens that they were part of something new in history. The world's best hope, as Thomas Paine had put it. Even the physical landscape took on nationalist meaning. Artists in the Hudson River Valley or travelers to Niagara Falls would describe American nature as grand and unspoiled, seeing in it a source of national pride. The idea that America's natural wonders rivaled Europe's ancient monuments.